Treasury Board President Anita Anand there announcing some details of $500 million in government cuts today. It's the first step towards the promised $15 billion in government savings over the next 5 years, coming just over a week before Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland will open up the books and deliver an economic update. The minister announced today that the date for the fall economic statement is set for November 21st. Our front bench is here to dig into the political stakes of that mini budget. Former Toronto Mayor John Tory is with us. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt is here. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. And CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair rounds us out this evening. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Very good to see you. I'll start with Minister Anand and supplementary estimates. In non-layman's terms, I should say, is what was tabled today, Lisa. The cuts are, we mentioned the overall period, but in the immediacy, a very small portion of overall spending, $500 million to the government's $443 billion spending estimates. Why do you think the government, I mean, it's not even normal for them to come out and talk about supplementary estimates in this instance. Why do you think they might be politically right now?
I think that they want to show that they're fiscally prudent. I think that the Minister of Finance is going to give Canadians extremely bad news on November 21st, just to show you how difficult it is in Canada, and that they want to get out ahead of the ball and say, but look, we know it's bad and we're already tightening our belts here in Ottawa. We're making sure that we're looking after your tax dollars here. So it makes sense that they would want to try to lay some foundation for the really hard medicine that's about to follow.
Can I follow up really quickly before I bring in Tom and John and just ask you what you think the bad news is and how bad you think it will be on November 21st?
I think the government of Canada is struggling to figure out how they're going to keep the money flowing, not in terms of the responsibilities on transfers to provinces or transfers to individuals, but I think they're at their limit in terms of programming, and I think it's a very real wall that they're about to hit.
John, let me ask you about how they end up navigating that wall, because they haven't had to for a very long time, right? Partly due to the pandemic, but partly due to their own ethos and the way in which they felt it was appropriate to spend money. The narrative has very much changed, or at least their communications around it have. Now this is kind of the first real test of what they meant by fiscal responsibility or fiscal prudence. What are your expectations?
Well, I think in terms of bad news, they don't have to really make an effort to put bad news forward, because I think Canadians already understand it in their own lives. And they understand, I think, as well, that it is time they want to see the government, yes, doing all the things they promised, dental and all that stuff, but at the same time pulling in their belt a bit. And so I think that is a necessary component. But I think what's going to be more important and part of this balancing act that the minister has to do is to provide some hope and some support for a part that hasn't really got talked about much in the midst of all the discussions about dental and about climate change and so on, which is, smaller businesses and affordability. I think Premier Ford, for example, in Ontario, has done a better job of actually doing things that are relatable to people about affordability, because there are things, they made a bit of a hash of the stuff on out east on the carbon tax, but at the same time there are measures like that don't apply necessarily to climate change or the carbon tax that they could be doing, albeit in the face of very serious financial problems. So I think they've got to combine a bit of a message of hope, a bit of a recognition of the reality that Canadians are facing more so than they have so far, with a recognition of the fact they also have to pull in their belt a bit, because we aren't in the good times anymore. I'm not sure we were, but we're not in them certainly as of now.
Kind of stringing those 2 points from Lisa and John together, Tom, how much wiggle room, though, does the government have to do that? If they have to restrain spending in order to not work against monetary policy, but at the same time address affordability with measures like relief that do potentially risk increasing inflation, how do you get around those things and then land a political win out of it, if that's even, maybe a win isn't even possible. I'm being too ambitious, not a loss.
No, and the $500 million that they were actually holding a press conference about today, it should be borne in mind that that's 0.1% of the federal budget. And they're going, look at what we just did. Look, long before the pandemic hit, Mr. Trudeau had already overspent any of his promises from the 2015 campaign. We all remember he was saying he's going to have tiny little deficits and it would be short term, but it would be for great causes. By the time the pandemic hit, he had already overspent by $100 billion, and now it's hundreds and hundreds of billions. And that, of course, as you just correctly said, Vassy, fed inflation. There's another part of this that I'd like to mention, because I think that it's part of the background. I think that Chrystia Freeland is thinking quite a bit about Chrystia Freeland as she's doing this. Not in the sense that she cares more about herself than Canadians. I'm sure she's going to have some good stuff on housing and on affordability. But she's also keenly aware of the fact that if indeed, a lot of people are speculating on this, Mr. Trudeau does decide to hang up his skates, well, she would be in the running, obviously. She's made that quite clear. She's going to wear everything that's happened under her watch with Justin Trudeau, unlike, say, Mark Carney, who gets a bit of a pass on this stuff because he's been outside it. So she's going to be thinking, of course, about her own role in bringing these measures forward. Trudeau is going to be thinking about his legacy, if it is indeed the case that he's thinking of maybe packing it in. So that's, I think, part of the picture that we're going to see when they roll out these numbers next week.
I guess, Lisa, though, just jumping off that point as well, how difficult is it for the finance minister, who has probably been one of the louder voices publicly facing around the importance of being fiscally prudent, to kind of meet the moment when it comes to affordability as well, and to deal with the legacy of a lot of program spending?
Yeah, she's going to have to define the problem really clearly and make sure that Canadians understand what the mission is. If you go back to the Paul Martin days, right? What happened with Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin is we hit a debt wall and we were being thought of as a developing nation. And as a result, all Canadians understood what the mission was. It was to slay the deficit and to make sure that we pay down the debt. And people rallied behind it, and program review happened, and the rest is history. I don't think that narrative has necessarily been built to a sufficient pitch yet for the deputy prime minister to come in and make any kind of radical changes. Maybe that's what the fall economic statement will do leading up to the next budget. But certainly you got to build the foundation for that kind of narrative and a call to arms for all Canadians to work together and tighten all of our belts before we end up with a real problem with respect to the Canadian economy.
John, do you think that the minister can deliver that or define that message?
Well, maybe, but I think what the government as a whole has to do, and she can start with the economic statement, is actually deliver on some of the things they've talked about and where they have allocated the money. You know, that's what's got us into a difficult financial situation, is they've made various announcements on various fronts. But I can tell you, as someone who, you know, when I was mayor of Toronto, was sitting watching these funds being announced for mental health, and I will say on housing, they delivered things that I, was very much a part of and saw them deliver, and there are houses and housing people today and standing, because of their work. But on many of these other things, people are hearing all these announcements and they haven't been very good at executing. And then once they've executed, drawing attention to the fact they've executed so people actually know some of what they're doing with all that money. So to me, it isn't a matter of certainly of spending more. In fact, that's why these savings are important to highlight. But it's more executing on the things they have said they're going to do on things like mental health, on housing, and making sure they actually draw attention to these things, which will help the economy, but also will address some of the issues people really care about, more so than some of the stuff that's been debated for the last number of weeks on end.